The first phone call I ever made in a crisis was to my mother. The last phone call she ever needed to make in hers was to me. That's not a coincidence. That's a bond built over 53 years, one ordinary act of love at a time. Rebecca Watson wasn't complicated. She never tried to be. Life had a way of adding enough complexity on its own, and she met it the same way every time. Steady, quiet, without needing recognition. She was the kind of mother who didn't just attend my little league games. She arrived early, folding chair tucked under her arm, like it was part of her routine. Rain or heat didn't matter. If I was on that field, she was in those stands. She packed my lunch long past the age where I pretended not to need it. I'd roll my eyes, make a show of it in front of friends, but I still ate everything she made. She knew I would. She always knew. And every time I stayed out late as a teenager, pushing limits the way boys do, she never greeted me with anger. She sat in the living room with the light on, waiting. Not because she wanted to control me, but because she couldn't rest until she knew I was home safe. That was her version of love. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. When my father passed 12 years ago, one of those grey November mornings that stains everything after it, she didn't collapse the way people expect. She carried it quietly. She sold a car to pay for the funeral before I even had the chance to offer help. And by the time I found out, it was already done. That was her way. Problems didn't get announced, they got handled. She lived on a fixed income after that. But you'd never know it walking into her house on a Sunday. There was always food, always enough for whoever happened to show up. No invitation needed. And in all those years, not once did she call me to say she was struggling. Not once did she ask for help. So when Rebecca Watson called me at exactly 7:42 on a Wednesday morning and said her chest felt strange, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh options, because 53 years of being loved like that doesn't create hesitation. It creates instinct. You move immediately. What it doesn't prepare you for is someone standing in your way. My name is Wesley Watson. I'm 53 years old. I coach youth baseball on weekends, and for most of my adult life, I believed something that took me far too long to unlearn. That keeping the peace meant you actually had peace. Turns out those are two very different things. That morning I was standing in the kitchen watching coffee drip into the pot, slow and steady, like even it wasn't ready to start the day, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I saw her name and picked up before it could ring again. Mom? Wesley? Something in her voice wasn't right. Thin, fragile in a way I had never heard before. This was a woman who had carried loss, hardship, and years without ever sounding small, and suddenly she did. You okay? I asked, already moving without realizing it. I didn't want to bother you, she said. Of course she didn't. 82, years old and still apologizing for needing anything. It's just tight, she added, and my arm feels strange. That was enough. I'm coming, I said, cutting off whatever she was about to say next. I ended the call and stood still for exactly 3 seconds, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I needed to think fast. My truck was at the mechanic, alternator gone, not ready until Friday. Then I remembered. Eve's car, silver Honda CR-V, sitting in the driveway with a full tank she'd filled 2 days earlier. Problem solved. Eve was upstairs. I could hear the shower running, long and steady like it always did, like she had nowhere else to be in the world. I walked to the bottom of the stairs. Eve! Nothing. Eve! The water shut off. A pause followed, long enough to feel deliberate. Then her voice came down. What? Not concern. Not urgency. Just irritation. I need your car, I said. My mom's having chest pains. I need to get her to the hospital. Silence. Not the kind where someone is thinking. The kind where someone has already decided and is choosing how to say no. A few seconds later, she appeared at the top of the stairs. Robe tied, towel wrapped around her hair, face completely blank. I can't today, she said. I stared at her, trying to process what I had just heard. Eve, her arm is going numb. I heard, you. She leaned against the doorframe like this. Was a minor inconvenience. Call an ambulance. She hates ambulances. You know that. Then call someone else. She turned like the conversation was already over. I have dinner tonight. she added over her shoulder. And a full day of work. I'm not spending hours in a hospital waiting. Room. Something inside me went quiet. Not loud, not explosive, just still. Eve, I said, my voice lower now, trying to pull her back into reality. This could be serious. She stopped halfway into the bedroom and looked back at me, and I will remember that look for the rest of my life. It wasn't anger. It wasn't guilt. It was inconvenience. She's your mother, Wesley, she said. Not mine. Then after a small pause she added, figure it out, and she closed the door gently. Like nothing important had just been said, like we had just talked about groceries. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, not because I didn't know what to do, but because something inside me had just shifted, and I didn't have words for it yet. Then I pulled out my phone. Clinton Webb lived 4 houses down. Retired electrician, the kind of man who still believed in showing up. He picked up on the first ring. Wes? I need a favor, I said. Mom's having chest pains. My truck's in the shop. Can you drive us to the hospital? No hesitation. Give me 4 minutes. That was it. No questions, no conditions, just action. I called my mom back, told her help was on the way, told her to unlock the door and sit down. She tried to apologize again. I didn't let her finish. Clinton pulled up in less than 4 minutes. I know because I counted every second, and as I got into that car, leaving behind a house that suddenly didn't feel the same anymore, I realized something I didn't fully understand yet. Some people show up when it matters, and some people make you figure it out. The drive to the hospital took less than 10 minutes, but it felt longer, stretched thin by the sound of my own thoughts catching up to me. My mother sat in the back seat beside me, her hand small in mine, wearing that same blue coat she always chose when something mattered. Like she was heading somewhere, important instead of being rushed toward uncertainty. She kept apologizing the entire way, soft and steady, like it was her responsibility that the morning had been interrupted. Clinton waved it off every time without even turning around, telling her it was nothing, that he'd been up already, that he had nowhere else to be. That's who he was, the kind of man who didn't need to announce his character because it showed up before he spoke. I sat there listening to them, watching the city pass by through the window, and something cold settled deeper in my chest. Not loud, not explosive, just present, like a truth that had been waiting for the right moment to be seen. We pulled into the emergency entrance, and everything moved quickly after that. Nurses, questions, forms, a wheelchair she didn't want but accepted anyway, and within minutes she was taken through those double doors while I was left on the other side holding nothing but time. Hospitals have a way of slowing everything down and speeding it up at the same time, and I sat there in that waiting area watching a muted television I couldn't follow, holding a paper cup of coffee I couldn't taste, replaying the morning in my head piece by piece whether I wanted to or not. Eve didn't call, didn't text, didn't check in, not once, and I noticed that more than I wanted to admit. After a while, a nurse came out and told me they were running tests, that the doctor would speak to me soon, that she was stable for now, and I nodded like that was enough to settle something inside me. Even though it wasn't, time stretched again, minutes folding into each other, until they stopped feeling separate, until finally a doctor approached calm, measured, the kind of man who chose his words carefully. He explained that it wasn't a full heart attack, that it was a warning, something the body does when it's been pushed long enough, and they wanted to keep her for observation, adjust medications, monitor closely. Stable, he said again, and I held onto that word like it meant more than it did. When I was finally allowed to see her, she looked smaller in that bed than I had ever seen her, but her eyes were clear, steady, the same as they had always been. And the first thing she said when I walked in wasn't about pain or fear. It was, "You came," just that. 2 words, simple, direct, and heavier than anything else in that room. I told her of course I came, that I would always come, and she nodded like she believed me, like she needed to hear it anyway. I stayed with her for hours, watching the monitors, listening to the rhythm of machines and footsteps in the hallway, answering small questions she didn't need answers to keep conversation alive. We even found a way to laugh at something ridiculous on the television once they turned the sound on. and for a moment it almost felt normal, like we weren't sitting inside something fragile. But underneath that, something else was building, quiet and steady, and I didn't look at it yet. When I stepped out to the hallway, I called Clinton, told him she was stable, heard the relief in his voice like it was his own family, and he said something simple that stuck with me longer than I expected, that this is what people do, they show up. I thanked him again, though it didn't feel like enough. And when I went back into the room, my mother was watching me in a way that told me she was thinking deeper than she was saying. Late in the afternoon, just before I left for the day, she reached for my hand again, her grip still warm, still steady, and said my name in that tone she only used when something mattered. I knew what was coming before she said it. Eve didn't come, she said, not as a question, but as a statement she had already answered. I hesitated just for a second, then told her the truth, that Eve had other plans, that she went out to dinner. The words felt heavier leaving my mouth than they should have, like they carried more than just information. My mother didn't react the way most people would. She didn't get angry, didn't raise her voice, didn't criticize. She just nodded slowly and turned her gaze toward the window, where the fading afternoon light stretched across the skyline in a quiet, almost tired way. There was a shift in her expression, subtle but unmistakable, like something inside her had settled into place. She didn't say anything else about it, and somehow that said more than words ever could. I kissed her forehead before I left, told her I'd be back in the morning, and she smiled in that small, familiar way that had carried me through most of my life. Walking out of that hospital felt different than walking in. The air outside was colder, sharper, and I stood there for a moment before getting into Clinton's car again, realizing that something inside me had changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but permanently. On the drive home, neither of us said much, and we didn't need to. Some silences don't ask to be filled. They just sit there, honest and complete. And somewhere between the hospital and my front door, I stopped trying to justify what had happened that morning. I stopped making space for it to make sense. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect anger to feel. I was something else entirely, something quieter, something final. By the time I got home, I already knew one thing for certain. Even if I hadn't said it out loud yet, the man who walked into that house that night wasn't the same man who had walked out of it that morning. And whatever came next, it wasn't going to look the way it used to. I woke up the next morning before the alarm. The kind of waking where your body is already done pretending it can rest. The room was still dark, quiet, but there was something sitting on my chest that sleep hadn't touched. I lay there on my side of the bed, the left side, always the left, staring at the ceiling like it might offer an answer if I looked at it long enough. Eve was still asleep beside me, breathing evenly, completely undisturbed, like the previous day had never happened. That used to comfort me once, that kind of calm. Now it felt like distance. I got up without making noise and went downstairs, started the coffee machine louder than usual, and for the first time in years, I didn't care if it woke her. Some things lose their importance overnight. I sat at the kitchen table, watched the light slowly push its way through the window, and thought about my mother in that hospital bed, about the way she had looked at me and said, "You came," like it meant more than anything else in the world. That stayed with me. It didn't just stay. It settled somewhere permanent. By the time Eve came downstairs, I was already on my second cup. She paused in the doorway, glanced at me, then at the coffee machine. Like something about the scene didn't match her expectations. "You're up early," she said, pouring herself a cup. "So are you," I replied, not looking up. There was a pause, the kind that waits for someone to acknowledge what's really going on. She broke it. "How is Rebecca?" "Not Mom." "Not your mom, Rebecca. Like a name you use for someone you don't belong to." "Stable," I said. "They kept her overnight, monitoring." She nodded slowly, like she was processing something that required effort. Another pause. Then she said, "Yesterday was complicated for me." I almost smiled at that, but not because it was funny, because it was so completely disconnected from reality that it didn't even land the way it should have. "Complicated," I repeated quietly. She shifted slightly, like she wanted me to meet her halfway. "I had work and then dinner plans, and I just I stood up before she could finish, rinsed my mug in the sink, and cut her off the same way I had cut off my mother the day before. "I heard you," I said. "You were clear." That stopped her. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To see my mother," I said, and this time I didn't wait for a response. Clinton was already outside by the time I stepped out, leaning against his car like he had nowhere else to be. He didn't ask anything, didn't bring up yesterday, just nodded and got in the driver's seat. The ride to the hospital was quiet, but it wasn't heavy. It was steady, grounded, the kind of quiet that doesn't need explanation. When we got there, he said he'd wait again, and I didn't argue this time. Some people don't offer, they just do, and you learn to accept it. My mother was sitting up when I walked in, glasses on, a crossword puzzle open in her lap like nothing had happened. She looked up at me and said, "7 letters, betray." I stopped in the doorway, stared at her, and she held that straight face for exactly 2 seconds before adding, "For the puzzle." I laughed louder than I expected, the kind of laugh that comes from relief and something else mixed together. "Perfect," I said, taking the chair beside her. We sat like that for a while, filling in answers, talking about nothing important, which somehow made it important. But eventually the shift came. I saw it in the way she closed the book, the way she placed it down carefully, like she was setting something aside to make room for something else. "I'm calling Paul today," she said. That got my attention. Paul Logan wasn't someone you called casually. He was precise, deliberate, the kind of lawyer who didn't waste time and didn't make mistakes. "Mom," I started, but she cut me off before I could say anything else. "Wesley Andrew Watson. Full name." That was enough. I stopped talking. She looked at me with that same steady clarity she'd had my entire life. "I've been thinking," she said, "and I'm done. Ignoring what's been right in front of me." There was no anger in her voice. That's what made it heavier. "Eve didn't show up," she continued. "Not yesterday. Not before that either." And then she started listing moments, not dramatically, not emotionally, just accurately. My father's funeral, her surgery, holidays, times when showing up wasn't optional, it was expected. And every time Eve had found a reason not to be there. I had known all of it. I had explained it away every single time. "I'm not angry," she said calmly. "I'm just done pretending." That hit harder than anything else she could have said, because it wasn't about yesterday anymore. It was about years. Years I had spent convincing myself things were fine because it was easier than admitting they weren't. She reached for her phone, dialed Paul's number from memory, and when he answered, her voice didn't shake once. She told him she wanted to update her will. Today, specific changes, final decisions. I sat there listening, feeling something build in my chest, something that wasn't guilt and wasn't relief, something sharper, clearer. By the time she hung up, it was done. Not legally yet, but emotionally, completely. "You don't have to do this for me," I said quietly. She looked at me over her glasses. "I'm not doing it for you," she replied. "I'm doing it because I've earned the right to decide where my life goes, and I've decided." There was nothing to argue with in that, nothing to fix, nothing to soften. For the first time in a long time, things were exactly what they were, no explanation needed. When Paul arrived later that afternoon, everything moved quickly, efficiently, like it had been waiting for this moment. Papers were reviewed, changes were made, and I watched as something that had been assumed for years was rewritten in less than an hour, not dramatically, not emotionally, just deliberately. And as I sat there listening, understanding what it meant, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to fully accept before. This wasn't just my mother drawing a line. This was the consequence of every moment that had come before it, finally catching up. And there was no undoing that. By the time I left the hospital that day, the air outside felt different again, sharper, clearer, like something had been stripped away. My phone stayed silent in my pocket the entire drive home. Eve hadn't called, not once. She had no idea what had just happened. No idea that everything she had quietly counted on for years had just changed. But that was about to catch up too. The next morning didn't feel like a continuation of anything. It felt like a turning point I hadn't agreed to, but was already standing inside. I woke up again before the alarm, Same heaviness in my chest, same silence in the house. But this time something had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't denial. It was recognition. I wasn't reacting to events anymore. I was starting to see them clearly for what they were. Eve was still in bed when I got up, still wrapped in the kind of sleep that suggested nothing had changed for her. That alone said more than anything she could have said awake. I got dressed quietly, not out of respect but habit, and then stopped for a second in the hallway. Like my body was waiting for permission. I wasn't going to give it anymore. I left without saying anything. Clinton was already outside again. Same spot, same posture. Like he'd decided his mornings belonged to me now until further notice. He didn't ask where we were going, just opened the passenger door and waited. That kind of silence between men doesn't need explanation. We drove straight to the hospital. When I walked into my mother's room, she was already awake, sitting up reading glasses on, crossword open like yesterday. Hadn't been anything more than a small interruption in her routine. She looked up and said, 6 letters, regret. I didn't even question it anymore. I just shook my head and sat down. You're enjoying this too much, I said. It keeps me sharp, she replied without looking up. But I could tell she was watching me more than the puzzle. There was a shift in her, not physically, but in the way she carried the room. Like something had been decided, and she was no longer waiting for permission to act on it. After a while, she closed the book again, slower this time, more deliberate, and placed it on the table beside her. That movement alone told me the conversation was changing. Paul is coming again, she said. I already knew. Today, she added. I nodded but didn't speak. She studied me for a moment longer than usual, like she was measuring something she couldn't see directly. You've been quiet, she said. I'm listening, I replied. She gave a small nod like that was acceptable. Then she leaned back slightly, adjusting the blanket over her legs. I don't want you to misunderstand what's happening, she said. Nothing here is emotional. It's not anger. It's correction. That word stayed with me longer than I expected. Correction, not punishment, not reaction. Correction implied something had been out of place for a long time and was only now being aligned. I didn't respond, because there wasn't anything to argue against. A few minutes later, Paul Logan arrived again. Same suit, same briefcase, same calm precision in his movements. He nodded at me, greeted my mother respectfully, and sat down like he had already prepared for whatever was coming. There was no small talk this time, no easing into anything. My mother went straight into it. Her voice was steady, controlled, almost clinical in its clarity. She reviewed what had been drafted, pointed out what needed to change, and he adjusted it in real time, marking notes without hesitation. I sat in the corner again, watching something that felt less like a conversation and more like a structural shift happening in real time. What had once been assumed was being dismantled piece by piece and rebuilt into something entirely different. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. At one point, Paul paused, looked at her carefully, and said something about ensuring everything reflected her intent clearly. And she simply replied, "It does." That was it. No explanation needed. No emotional framing. Just certainty. When he finished, he closed the folder, stood up, and for a moment, the room felt quieter than it had all morning. "I'll finalize everything today," he said. "It will be legally binding by tomorrow morning." My mother nodded once. Good. That was the end of it for her. But not for me, because I understood, sitting there, exactly what had just happened. This wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't about documents or signatures or legal adjustments. It was about recognition, about acknowledgement of what had been consistent and what had not. And somewhere deep in that realization, something uncomfortable started forming. Not regret, not yet. Something earlier than that, awareness. My mother went back to her crossword, but I could tell she wasn't really solving it anymore. She was thinking. And I was doing the same thing, just without a puzzle in front of me. Eventually she spoke again without looking up. "She'll call you," she said. I knew who she meant, Eve. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say yet. We stayed like that for a while longer, neither of us rushing to fill the silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just honest. And that honesty felt heavier than anything else in the room. Later that afternoon, I drove home alone. Clinton had offered to wait again, but I told him I needed to do it myself this time. He didn't argue, just nodded like he understood more than I was saying. The drive back felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of everything sitting inside it. When I pulled into the driveway, Eve's car was there. Same place, same stillness, but something about it felt different now, like it belonged to a version of life I wasn't fully part of anymore. I sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. No calls, no texts, nothing, just silence stretching longer than it used to. When I finally walked through the door, she was in the living room, sitting upright, waiting. That alone told me she already knew something had changed. Her phone was in her hand, screen lit up, but she wasn't using it, just holding it like it had been. Ringing all day, and she was finally running out of ways to ignore it. She stood up when she saw me. Not fast, not slow, just carefully. "We need to talk," she said. I didn't answer right away. I closed the door first. Then I looked at her. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. This wasn't about a single decision anymore. It wasn't even about my mother's will. It was about everything that had led here. Every ignored moment, every dismissed priority. Every time I had convinced myself that silence meant peace. And now that silence was finally speaking back. I didn't know what was coming next. But for the first time, I wasn't pretending it would stay the same. The engine was still, running when I realized I hadn't actually decided where I was going. My hands were on the wheel, but my mind wasn't on the road. It was back in that living room. Back in Eve's face. Back in the moment she finally understood that silence from me wasn't anger anymore. It was distance. Permanent distance forming in real time. I drove without music for a while. Just the low hum of the tires on asphalt and the cold air pressing through the vents. Everything outside looked the same as it always had, but nothing inside me matched it anymore. There's a strange feeling. That comes when your life doesn't collapse dramatically, but instead quietly stops fitting you. No explosion. No final argument that makes a movie scene. Just a realization that you've been living inside, something that no longer recognizes you. I ended up parking near the river, not because I planned to, but because my body remembered places my mind hadn't chosen yet. I sat there watching the water move like it didn't care what anyone had lost on land. My phone stayed silent for a long time. Eve didn't call again. Maybe she finally understood that calling wasn't the same as reaching. At some point, I stopped waiting for it to vibrate. That was new for me. Not waiting, not bracing. Just existing without expecting interruption. My thoughts drifted back to my mother again. The way they kept doing now, like she had become the center of gravity in my life without even trying. She hadn't demanded anything. She hadn't threatened, manipulated, or pushed. She had simply lived her life in a way that made everything else look louder than it needed to be. And for the first time, I understood what she meant in that hospital room. Not just the will, not just the legal changes, but the deeper message underneath it. She wasn't removing Eve out of anger. She was aligning everything she had built with the truth she had been avoiding seeing clearly for years. People show you who they are in emergencies. Not in words, but in movement. Who runs toward you? Who delays? Who calculates? Who decides your crisis is inconvenient? My mother had always run toward everyone she loved. Eve had measured distance first. That difference had always been there. I just hadn't wanted to name it. I stayed in the truck until the sky shifted slightly, that dull winter brightness fading toward late afternoon. Eventually, I started the engine again and drove without a destination for a while, just letting the roads decide for me until I found myself back near Maplewood Drive. I didn't go inside right away. I parked a little further down the street and just sat there looking at the house where I grew up. It looked the same as it always had, but now I saw it differently. Not as a place I visited, but as a place I belonged to. My mother wasn't just inside it physically. She was embedded in it, in every decision that kept it standing, in every sacrifice that made it feel like home instead of just shelter. I finally went in when the cold became uncomfortable enough to move me. She was in the kitchen, exactly where I expected her to be, sitting at the table, with a blanket over her shoulders and her crossword book open again, like the last few days. Hadn't changed her rhythm at all. She looked up when I walked in and smiled like nothing in the world had shifted. Too far out of place. That alone almost broke something in me. "You look like you've been thinking too much," she said casually, as if she could read the weight in my silence without asking for details. I sat down across from her, not immediately speaking, just watching her for a moment. She was smaller than I remembered in some ways, but stronger in presence than most people twice her size. "I went home," I finally said. She nodded slowly, like she already knew that part. "And?" she asked. That was her way. Never pushing. Just opening a door and letting you decide if you were ready to walk through it. I hesitated before answering, because the truth wasn't simple. "She was waiting," I said. Not in the way she used to. Not like before. It felt different. My mother didn't interrupt. She just listened, her hands resting gently over her crossword book. "She understood something today," I added. "I think she finally did." My mother exhaled softly, almost like she had been carrying an answer for a long time and finally heard it confirmed. "People understand many things too late," she said quietly. "The question is what they do after. Understanding." That sentence stayed in the room longer than anything else we said. I leaned back in the chair, looking at the ceiling for a moment. "She kept calling," I said. "Over and over again." My mother nodded once. "Guilt makes noise," she replied calmly. "Love does not." That contrast landed harder than anything else that day. I looked back at her. "Do you regret it?" I asked. Not the will specifically. Not just that, everything, the years, the choices, the way she had always shown up without ever asking for equal weight in return. She didn't answer immediately. That silence felt different from Eve's silence. Eve's silence avoided. My mother's silence considered. Finally, she shook her head slightly. "No," she said simply. "I don't regret love. I only regret where it wasn't fully received." There was no bitterness in her voice, only clarity, and somehow that made it heavier. We sat like that for a while. No urgency in the conversation anymore. Just two people finally standing in the aftermath of decisions that had already been made. Eventually, she closed her crossword book and set it aside. "You're going to have to decide what you do next," she said gently. I looked at her. "I already did," I replied without realizing. I meant it until I said it out loud. She studied me for a moment, then nodded again like she approved of something that had finally aligned correctly. I stayed for dinner that night. Simple food, nothing special, but everything tasted different when it wasn't being eaten in a house that felt like emotional debt. My mother didn't ask me about Eve again. That was another thing I noticed. She didn't repeat questions once she had the answer she needed. Later that night, when I finally left Maplewood, drove back toward the life I was in the process of exiting, I didn't feel rushed anymore. That was the biggest shift. No urgency, no emotional sprint. Just inevitability unfolding at its own pace. Eve was still in the house when I returned. The lights were on, but she wasn't sitting in the same place anymore. She was upstairs when I came in, and for a moment I stood in the hallway just listening to the quiet. Not silence. Something more unsettled than that. A home that knew change was happening. Inside it, but hadn't yet decided how to respond. She came down a few minutes later. Her movements were slower now, less controlled. Not broken, but no longer armored in the same way. "Where were you?" she asked, but it wasn't demanding anymore. It sounded tired. I looked at her for a moment before answering. "With my mother," I said. She nodded slowly, like she expected that answer, but didn't know what to do with it. There was a pause between us that felt longer than it should have. "I didn't think it would become this," she said quietly. I didn't respond immediately, because that was the part that mattered. Not what she thought, not what she expected, but what she chose when she had the chance to think differently. "That's the thing," I finally said. "It didn't become this. It was already this. We just stopped ignoring it." That landed heavily. She looked down for a moment, then back up at me. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not defense, just realization without an exit strategy. "So what now?" she asked. The question wasn't dramatic anymore. It was practical, real. I exhaled slowly. Now, I said, we stopped pretending nothing changed. She nodded faintly. Not agreement. Not resistance. Just acknowledgement. I picked up a small bag I had already packed earlier, without fully admitting to myself what it meant. I hadn't left everything behind, but I had stopped pretending I was staying fully inside it. Eve watched the bag but didn't ask where I was going. That silence told me she already knew the direction, even if she didn't know the exact destination. Before I left, I paused near the door, not because I wanted to say something powerful, but because I needed to end it cleanly in my own mind. You weren't wrong about everything, I said quietly, but you were wrong about what matters most when someone you love needs you. She always closed her eyes briefly, like she felt the weight of that, without needing further explanation. I opened the door. The cold air hit me again, the same kind of honesty I had felt earlier. Unfiltered, uncomplicated. Stepped outside and didn't look back this time. Not because I was trying to be strong, but because looking back would have been a negotiation I was no longer willing to have with myself. Behind me, the house stayed lit. Inside it, a conversation that had lasted 11 years was finally ending without any more arguments left to speak. I got into my truck and started the engine. The sound was steady, familiar, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was carrying two lives at once, just one. My phone lit up once more on the dashboard. Unknown call. I didn't answer.